August 15, 1943. The fog over Kiska was so thick that the world felt reduced to a few yards of gray water, and the faint shapes of men and landing craft sliding toward a shoreline that nobody could truly see. Rifles were held high to keep them dry, boots were braced for the first step onto enemy ground, and officers tried to read maps that suddenly seemed like lies in the shifting mist. Somewhere ahead, the Allied command believed, waited a Japanese garrison dug into rock and tundra, ready to bleed the first wave and then the second and then the third. The order had been given. The assault was moving, and almost nobody on those boats knew the most important fact of the day. The island they were about to take had already been abandoned. If you enjoy documentary stories like this, subscribe to the channel and write a comment right now about what you think happened on Kiska before the first shots were fired. Your comment helps the video reach more people, and it tells me what stories you want next. Operation Cottage was supposed to be the closing punch of the Aleutian campaign, a hard, cold, easily forgotten corner of the Second World War where weather killed as efficiently as bullets. The Aleutian chain stretches like a broken spine from Alaska toward Asia, and in 1940 to the Japanese seas to American islands at the far western end. Attu and Kiska, they were not prizes of wealth. They were symbols, airfields, stepping stones, and warnings. For the United States, the idea of enemy flags on American soil was a wound of pride and a potential threat to the northern approaches. For the Japanese, the occupation was a way to complicate American planning, draw resources away from the Central Pacific, and create a forward screen in terrible terrain that few planners truly understood. By the summer of 1943, Attu had already shown what that terrain could do. The battle there was savage, cold, mud, cliffs, fog, and sudden close combat. The Japanese garrison fought almost to the last man, and the American forces paid heavily in blood and injury. Attu became a lesson written in frostbite and graves if Kiska was defended the same way. The next landing could be just as brutal. So for Operation Cottage, American and Canadian leaders assembled an overwhelming force, determined to avoid a repeat of Attu's costly nightmare. They planned for resistance in depth, for ambushes in the fog, for hidden machine guns in lava rock, for artillery registered on beaches and valleys. They planned for tunnels and bunkers. They planned for a fight in which the enemy might not even be visible until the moment he fired. The island itself seemed designed to confuse and punish. Kiska is volcanic, harsh, and treeless in many places, with ridgelines that disappear into cloud and gullies that turn into traps. The weather can change within minutes. Fog rolls in like a living thing, swallowing landmarks and turning distances into guesses. A squad can march a short span and feel as if it has crossed into another world, with wet clothing, numb fingers, and boots that never fully dry. In that environment, even disciplined troops can lose orientation. Orders can be misunderstood. Units can drift off course. A shadow can become an enemy. A crack in the mist can look like movement. The island makes liars out of confident men. The Allied plan called for landings from multiple directions. A coordinated squeeze that would pin the defenders and prevent escape. There was logic in it. If the Japanese tried to withdraw into the mountains, they would be blocked. If they tried to counterattack the beaches, they would face prepared fire. If they tried to slip away by sea, patrols and air searches would complicate it. The size of the force reflected both caution and the memory of Attu, a large American contingent. Canadian units, supporting ships, aircraft, logistics, engineers, medical teams, signal troops, and all the machinery of an amphibious assault were thrown against a single island. Every man was told, in one form or another, to expect the worst. But the enemy had been doing his own calculations. After Attu, Japanese leaders understood that holding Kiska might not be worth the cost. They had already demonstrated that they could occupy the Aleutians. They had already forced the Americans to respond, and now they faced an overwhelming buildup. The reality was that Kiska was isolated. Supplying it was dangerous. Reinforcing it would be even more dangerous. American naval and air power pressed the approaches, and the weather that made defense possible also made resupply uncertain. In late July, under the very conditions that made Kiska such a nightmare for any attacker, the Japanese executed one of the quietest and most effective withdrawals of the war. Cloaked by fog and confusion, ships slipped in and took the garrison away. The island that Allied planners imagined as a fortress was emptied with a discipline that mocked the assumption that the Japanese would always fight to the last. So, when the Allied landing force moved on Kiska in mid-August, It approached an island that was still dangerous, but in a different way. It was not dangerous because of enemy rifles behind every rock. It was dangerous because it was full of traps left behind. Mines in the ground and in the sea, booby traps placed with malice. And the simple fact that thousands of armed men were about to operate in fog and rugged terrain with nerves stretched tight and expectations set for contact at any moment. The human mind does not easily turn fear off. When a soldier has been told that an enemy is waiting, his body prepares for it. His eyes search for it. His ears invent it. And in that state, a mistake can become a death sentence. The first hours of the landing were filled with cautious movement. The shoreline did not erupt with fire. There were no waves cut down in surf. There was no sudden roar of machine guns from ridges. Instead, there was the odd, almost supernatural silence of an empty battlefield. That silence did not reassure. It created anxiety. Men who expected shots felt more vulnerable when they heard none. Officers suspected tricks. Every abandoned position looked like bait. Every doorway looked like it had a rifle behind it. Patrols moved carefully, probing forward as if the island itself might spring a trap. They found evidence of occupation, dugouts, equipment, cables, abandoned supplies, signs of hurried departure. They found heavy installations that suggested the Japanese had been serious about defense. But they did not find the defenders' dot in good weather. This might have quickly turned into certainty. The enemy was gone. In the Aleutians, good weather is a luxury. Fog reduced visibility to the point where the friendly units could be within a short distance and still not know it. Radios were not always reliable in that environment. Terrain broke formations. Men became separated. Small groups took wrong turns. And once a rumor started, it moved faster than the truth. Someone would swear he had seen movement. Someone would report a shot. Someone would find a wire and assume it was attached to a mine. Someone would stumble across a sudden noise and think it was a warning. All of it could be true and none of it could be enemy action. But in the moment, it did not matter. What mattered was the instinct that said, contact is imminent. The tragedy that made Operation Cottage infamous was that fear and fog turned Allied forces against each other. In the confusion of movement and the lack of a clear front line, American and Canadian troops, operating in separate columns and trying to link up, sometimes mistook each other for Japanese patrols. A silhouette in gray becomes a threat when you have been told the enemy will be wearing similar shapes and carrying similar rifles. A sudden sound becomes an ambush when the mind is already primed for it. And when one nervous man fires, others fire back, and then the incident becomes real. Regardless of whether it began as imagination, friendly fire is one of the oldest horrors of war because it requires no enemy presence to kill. Kiska proved that in a brutally ironic way. Men died expecting to die to Japanese bullets, only to be hit by Allied rounds in a battle against shadows. Those incidents were not the only cause of casualties. The Japanese left behind mines and booby traps precisely to punish anyone who came after them. An empty bunker can be wired. A doorway can be rigged. A path that looks convenient can be seeded. The Aleutians also punish with accident. Steep ground, wet stone, and exhaustion create falls, injuries, and mistakes with weapons. Even without an enemy, a battlefield is not safe. And on Kiska, the very act of searching for an enemy that was not there led men into danger that was out at sea. Another kind of threat waited: mines. The waters around Kiska had been defended with them, and a mine does not care who you are. A ship can be moving calmly, supporting an operation that seems to be going almost too easily, and then a hidden charge can tear into the hull with a violence. That feels like the sea itself has erupted. During the Kiska operation, a United States Navy destroyer struck a mine and suffered a catastrophic blast. Men who had survived storms and patrols were suddenly thrown into twisted metal and fire. In a moment, the illusion that this was a bloodless operation vanished. The sea filled with debris and oil. Rescue efforts began under the same cruel weather. Even when lives were saved, the shock remained. An island could be empty and still kill sailors far from shore. As the days passed, the scale of the mistake became undeniable. There were no Japanese patrols to flush out. There were no counterattacks to repel. There was no last stand in the hills. Instead, there were abandoned guns pointing at a sea that would not be challenged, empty huts still smelling of human presence, and defensive works that looked eerie in their quietness. The Allied force had prepared for a siege, but it was now performing a grim and methodical sweep, step by step, bunker by bunker, trying to prove a negative, that nobody remained. And in war, proving that an enemy is not present can take as much time as fighting him, because nobody wants to be the man who declares victory too early and then watches his unit get hit from behind. The psychological toll mattered. Troops were tense for days. Every time fog thickened, nerves tightened again. Men slept poorly. They listened for sounds that did not come. When something did come, a rock fall, a distant engine, a door banging in the wind, it could trigger a rush of adrenaline and a chain of decisions. In such conditions, discipline is tested not by the presence of the enemy, but by the absence of clear information. The human need for certainty pushes people toward conclusions. On Kiska, that need sometimes produced lethal errors strategically. The evacuation was a reminder that war is not only about courage or firepower, it is also about timing, information, and deception. The Japanese achieved something rare, a major withdrawal under the nose of an opponent, from a position the opponent believed was heavily defended, without turning it into a disaster. That required planning, coordination, and the willingness to abandon territory for a larger purpose. It also required exploiting the environment. Fog, which Allied troops feared on landing day, had already served as the Japanese ally in leaving. In the Aleutians, weather was a weapon. It obscured ships. It concealed movement. It erased clues. And it made even a powerful enemy feel blind. For the Allies, the lesson was bitter. Intelligence had failed in a practical way. The enemy had left, and the scale of the evacuation had not been confirmed before the landing. That does not mean there were no warnings. Reconnaissance was difficult. Fog hid activity. A lack of radio traffic can mean many things. Empty camps can be hidden. Ships can move undercover. But the outcome still exposed a painful truth. The largest amphibious assault force ever assembled for the Aleutians had landed on an island where the central premise of the operation, that the enemy was present, was wrong. And yet men still died. In a sense, those deaths were among the most tragic of the war, because they were not the price of defeating an enemy force in battle. They were the price of uncertainty, environment, and the friction that exists in any large operation. Operation Cottage also highlighted the complexity of coalition warfare. American and Canadian units trained together and shared purpose, but they still had differences in procedures, communications, and expectations. When visibility is good and the plan is unfolding clearly, those differences are manageable. When fog turns the world into a maze, those differences can widen into misunderstanding. A unit that shifts position without perfect communication can be mistaken for the enemy. A sound can be interpreted differently. In the worst moments, identity becomes ambiguous, and ambiguity is deadly. The friendly fire incidents on Kiska were not simply a story of individual mistakes. They were a story of how systems can break under stress, how a battlefield can dissolve the boundaries that keep friend and foe distinct, and how quickly chaos can erupt when a soldier believes he is being attacked. There was also the matter of expectations. After a coup, many Allied soldiers believed the Japanese would fight to the end on Kiska as well. That belief shaped everything: how they held their weapons, how they moved, how quickly they fired, how willing they were to accept risk. When a mind expects a threat, it interprets neutral information as hostile. That is not a moral failure. It is a human trait, but armies have to build procedures to manage it. On Kiska, the environment overwhelmed some of those procedures. Fog reduced the ability of leaders to control their formations. The ground disrupted lines of sight. The absence of a clear enemy prevented the establishment of a stable front. In that vacuum, fear filled the space. The irony is that the operation still accomplished its strategic objective. Kiska was secured. The Aleutians were cleared of Japanese forces. The northern flank of North America felt safer. But victory achieved in such a strange, costly way carries an aftertaste. It becomes a cautionary tale, because it shows that even success can be wasteful when information is incomplete. It also shows that a war can take lives even when the enemy is not physically present. Mines, traps, accidents, and friendly fire do not require a living opponent to operate. They only require an environment where danger is possible and humans are operating under stress. To understand why the Japanese evacuation mattered, it helps to see the broader Pacific War at that moment. In 1943, Japanese leaders were being forced to choose where to concentrate strength. The Central Pacific was heating up. The Solomon Islands campaign had been costly. The United States was building momentum. Holding a distant island in the Aleutians, difficult to supply and difficult to reinforce, began to look like a strategic distraction. Evacuating Kiska freed ships and men for other needs, and it avoided the kind of annihilation that had occurred on it too. It was, in cold military terms, a rational decision for the soldiers who later landed under the assumption that they were heading into a fortress. It was something else, a trick played by fog and distance. On the ground, the sweep of Kiska became an exercise in patience. Engineers and infantry searched for mines. They investigated bunkers. They secured airfields and installations. They documented abandoned equipment. They tried to ensure no small groups of Japanese had been left behind to conduct guerrilla attacks. Every empty trench had to be checked. Every cave had to be probed. Every suspicious object had to be approached as if it could kill. This kind of work is slow, and it grinds down morale. A soldier would rather fight a visible enemy than wrestle with invisible danger. The men on Kiska were asked to do the latter day after day, in cold mist, with wet clothing, with hands that ached, and in that slow grind, small mistakes could still be fatal. The story of Kiska has often been told as a dark joke, an invasion of an empty island, where the invaders shot at each other. That is not wrong in outline, but it can miss the real weight of what happened. Those were not comic deaths. They were real men killed in a place that felt unreal. The fog did not make it funny. It made it horrifying. Friendly fire deaths are among the hardest for families to accept, because they do not fit the simple narrative of war. Mines and accidents, too, can feel senseless. Kiska combined all of these into one operation, and that combination is why it is remembered. It is remembered because it shows how war can be absurd without being harmless, and how a plan can be executed perfectly and still produce tragedy, because the core assumption is wrong. There is also the deeper lesson about intelligence and verification. In an ideal world, commanders would always know whether an enemy is present before committing an invasion. In reality, especially in a place like the Aleutians, certainty can be impossible. Weather can block observation. The enemy can exploit that weather. Communications can be limited. A lack of evidence can be misread as a sign of hidden strength rather than absence. Decision makers must act under uncertainty, and sometimes they will be wrong. Operation Cottage was an example of that harsh reality. The Allies acted with the best caution they had. In response to a previous battle that had been costly, they assembled strength to avoid unnecessary loss. And still, loss occurred because the environment and uncertainty created their own battlefield. When historians look back at Kiska, they often emphasize the Japanese evacuation as an operational success and the Allied invasion as an intelligence failure. Both can be true, but the human story sits in the middle. Thousands of men stepping into fog, convinced they were about to fight for their lives, then spending days fighting the fear of a phantom enemy and losing comrades anyway. It is a story about the gap between what a soldier believes is happening and what is actually happening. That gap is where panic lives. It is where misidentification happens. It is where tragedy grows. And it is also a story about how quickly war can pivot from one kind of danger to another. When the first wave did not take fire, a different anxiety emerged. Why not? When patrols found empty positions, a new suspicion formed. Is this a trap? When someone heard a noise, the most likely explanation in the soldier's mind was enemy movement, because that was what he had been trained for. The mind resists the idea that a mission can be empty of its central purpose. It feels safer, in a twisted way, to believe there is an enemy, because then danger has a face. On Kiska, danger was faceless. It was fog, wire, mines, and friendly silhouettes in the end. Operation Cottage became one of those events that military planners study, not because it was a great battle, but because it shows how operations can go wrong even when the enemy is absent. It highlights the importance of identification procedures, communication between units, and disciplined fire control. It highlights the risks of complex multi-pronged landings in low-visibility terrain. It highlights the role of engineers and mine clearance. It highlights the psychological effect of expectation and the way fear shapes perception. And it highlights something simpler. War is not only a contest of armies. It is a contest of information. The side that knows more can sometimes win without fighting, and the side that knows less can bleed even in victory. So when you picture Kiska on that first day, do not picture a triumphant beach landing with flags and cheering. Picture men hunched under packs, stepping into cold water, scanning a blank shoreline, hearing only the ocean and the wind, feeling the fog cling to skin and cloth, and waiting for bullets that never come. Picture them moving inland through wet grass and volcanic rock, fingers numb around rifle stocks, hearts pounding at every imagined movement. Picture the moment when a friendly unit appears suddenly in the mist and both sides freeze, each trying to decide in a fraction of a second whether the figures ahead are allies or enemies. Picture how a single bad decision can ignite a storm of gunfire, and how quickly it is too late to take back the first shot. Picture the later realization, quiet and heavy, that there was never an enemy to defeat there, only danger to survive. That is why Kiska still matters, not because it was a decisive battlefield in the usual sense, but because it exposes the strange anatomy of war. It shows that the absence of an enemy does not guarantee safety. It shows that technology and numbers do not erase uncertainty. It shows that nature can be as powerful as any general. And it shows that sometimes the most haunting victories are the ones where the battlefield is silent. The bunkers are empty, and the dead belong to the side that came to win.